and then hello everyone. We're going to get started here just a second. We're going to try to let everyone get joined, get our closed captioning set up, get these spots highlighted. Let's see, we're going to have Tim as a spotlight. Perfect. We got that went pretty smoothly. Awesome. Would you mind sharing your screen there, Tim?
Yep. Or no, I don't mind. I'll share it. 1 second.
Too many screens open.
Too many screens. Okay, can you see it?
Yep. If you want to launch that, and I'll go ahead and get the introduction started. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for being patient for the little bit of transition. I'm running all of the Zoom meetings from my own Zoom link, which was, not well thought out, but we're rolling with the punches. So I appreciate your flexibility. And we're excited to have you all here. So as a friendly reminder, my name is Ty Aller, and I'm at Utah State University's Institute for Disability, our state's UCED. I'm also part of the MHDD Center and the AUCD Mental Health Special Interest Group leadership team. We really are genuinely excited to have you with us today for our second session of the day and our second day of the Mental Health Summit, online discussions on the intersection of mental health and developmental disabilities. Prior to getting started and introducing Dr. Riesen, I just wanted to briefly provide y'all with a bit of the Zoom etiquette that we're all probably used to. So just to let y'all know, we will be using the chat box, which we ask you use if you have any comments or technical issues. My colleague Kristen Dahl is also in here, and she'll be assisting me with any technical issues. So if anything comes up throughout the session, feel free to send me or her a direct message, and we'll do our best to try to take care of you. If you have questions for Dr. Riesen throughout the presentation, Kristen and I will also be monitoring those, and I believe Tim will have a little bit of time at the end to maybe address some of those questions, so we'll try to help facilitate that. To let all of you know, just to try to make the meeting go a little bit smoother, I've muted everyone and shut off the cameras. Please feel free, though, to actively engage in the chat. We did that a lot in the last session, and it was actually pretty fun. The webinar is also being live captioned. You can turn on captions down in the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window by clicking on that CC button, and you can adjust the controls there. We also have ASL interpreter services that should be highlighted on your screen at this moment, and you can also highlight them too, if that's more useful for you. Other than that, everything else should be pretty smooth sailing, and I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Timothy Riesen. So Dr. Riesen is the Division Director of the Research and Training Division at the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice at Utah State University. He's also a Research Associate Professor with an appointment in the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation at USU. Dr. Riesen has 30 years of experience working with people with significant disabilities. He's worked for adult residential programs that support people with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities, worked as a certified special educator serving 18 to 21-year-old students with disabilities, and has worked as a researcher and faculty member in institutes of higher education. He has conducted a number of single subject research studies on embedded instruction in secondary school and systematic instruction in community-based employment programs. He's conducted research on school-to-work barriers and customized employment. He's written articles on the Fair Labor Standards Act and its application to school-to-work programs, customized employment, and alternatives to guardianship. He's co-author of a 2016 book on transition, employment, and residential issues and job coaching, high leverage practices, and single subject research design. That's a big book, I'm guessing. And he has written training manuals for supported employment providers, presented local and national conference, and served as a consultant for community service providers, and provides great supervision to myself at the UCED that we live at. So without further ado, I'll switch the time over to Dr. Riesen, and he'll talk to us about transition to competitive integrated employment.
Thank you, Ty. The introductions are always a bit awkward, and when you write these introductions about yourself, you never know what to put. And so there were a couple run-on sentences in there for sure. So I'm sorry about those. Ty, one thing as I'm going through this presentation, I cannot see the chat box. So if you could field any questions that come through, that would be great.
Yeah, would you prefer that at the end, or would you prefer periodically throughout?
Yeah, I can just, if anybody has a question as I'm going, I'm happy to address questions as I'm moving through the presentation, and we can leave some time at the end as well.
All right, perfect. I'll do that.
Well, thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm excited to be here, and I just want to give a little bit of a caveat. I'm working on very little sleep right now, so if I don't articulate as well as I typically do, I apologize for that, and please forgive me. But I will get through this presentation, and we will hopefully you'll learn some information about competitive employment, and specifically transition employment. As Ty said, I have a long background in supporting people with disabilities, and my primary background is specific to intellectual and developmental disability. And that's really what I've been focusing my research efforts on over the past 5 to 10 years. It's really looking at how we improve outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So a lot of the things that I talk about is through the lens of supporting people with significant disabilities, in particular, individuals with the most significant disabilities. So I'm a firm believer that all people can work and all people should work, and that part of the issue that we have in terms of promoting better employment outcomes for people with the most significant disabilities is low expectations. And so one of the things that I really like to think about is how we promote better, higher expectations for people with disabilities. So as I was kind of thinking through this presentation and thinking through what I'd like to convey, I think it's really important to really provide a legislative timeline and review for transition-related work and what we've been trying to do over the past 50 years in terms of supporting people with disabilities obtain meaningful work. And we've been doing this for 50 years, and I'm going to show you here momentarily that we're still running into the same problems. And for me, this raises the question about expectations, going back to what I was just talking about, that there's something else going on, because we know how to do this stuff. We've been talking about this stuff for years. And in my mind, it really boils down to this expectation for employment. And so I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about this the legislation that supports provision for transitioning to employment for people with disabilities. I'm going to quickly review some outcome data from the American Community Survey and also data related to intellectual and developmental disabilities to really paint the picture of the problem that we're encountering in terms of employment for people with disabilities. And then I'll get into some strategies. And the strategies it's not, in my mind, it's not rocket science to promote better outcomes. It's just a matter of doing things we know work. And that means getting out in the community and talking to people and engaging in people and really identifying the strengths, interests, needs, and preferences of people with disabilities. So that'll be my agenda. As I indicated earlier, if you have questions, feel free to ask them as I'm presenting, and I'll leave a little time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So when we're thinking about employment and thinking about how we engage in employment for people with disabilities, from a legislative standpoint, we really have a long history of supporting people with disabilities. But the history is pretty interesting because prior to the 1970s, we didn't really think much about employment for people with disabilities, or we didn't have any specific legislative provisions that were designed to promote better outcomes. So prior to the Rehabilitation Act, which I'll explore here shortly, there were no legal protections for people with disabilities in regard to employment. So employers were not obligated to hire a person with a disability. They could blatantly discriminate against a person with a disability in regards to employment and retainment and wages. So there weren't a lot of protections. So in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was enacted. And the Rehabilitation Act, when you think about this piece of legislation, it's an amazing piece of legislation. It really has two pieces to it. The first piece is it's a civil rights piece of legislation, meaning it's designed to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities. So in essence, you cannot discriminate against a person, a qualified person with a disability in entities or programs that receive federal funds, okay? And it also provides closed-ended entitlements for people with disabilities. So when I talk about closed-ended entitlements, what I mean is that these entitlements are available based on funding. So if the funding's not there, an individual won't get those services or those specific entitlements. So the entitlements are centered around helping a person with a disability obtain meaningful employment, okay? So early on, when we're looking at this legislative timeline, the legislation was really centered and focused around access. So that's what we were thinking about, is access. People with disabilities were discriminated against or were not provided equal access to programs and services that people without disabilities were receiving. So if we move forward on the timeline, another really important piece of legislation is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So this is now referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? This was enacted in 1975. So prior to 1975, there were no specific protections for individuals with disabilities to receive services in schools or to access free, appropriate public education. So prior to this piece of legislation, schools could just make a unilateral decision to say we can't support a person with a disability because that person has too significant of a disability, or there wasn't specific due process protections for an individual with a disability. So Public Law 94-142 is a civil rights piece of legislation, and it also provides a funding piece of legislation and procedural safeguards for people with disabilities, okay? So we fast forward to 1981, and I'm just highlighting some of the most important pieces of legislation that are out there. 1981 was a really important time frame in terms of helping people with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities, start having access to community-based services and programs. And this was when the Social Security Act was amended to include a provision for home and community-based services waivers. So home and community-based service waivers were really designed to address what was called an institutional bias in programs and supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Prior to the home and community-based waiver services, or HCBS waivers, you'll hear that term, the acronym, that typically people with disabilities were placed in institutional congregate settings, and they didn't have a lot of access to community settings. So HCBS services were designed to get people embedded within their community. So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities embedded in their community through waivers, okay? Then we move forward to 1990. So in 1990, we saw the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted, signed into law by George Bush Sr. And this is a civil rights piece of legislation. And this is really designed to extend the provisions of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and provide greater access to programs and services and employment for all people with disabilities, right? So this has a number of important provisions that relate to promoting better outcomes for people with disabilities. First is the Title I employment provisions. So under Title I, employers cannot discriminate, or public or private employers cannot discriminate against an eligible person or a qualified person with a disability in regards to hiring, firing, and advancement. So this really started to protect people with disabilities in regard to employment. We also saw the Title II Public Services Integration Mandate. And this, in my mind, is one of the biggest game changers in terms of policy for people with disabilities. So Title II was really it was what the Supreme Court used in Olmstead to make the landmark Olmstead decision that said people with disabilities should be provided services in the greater community context. And so this Title II has really changed the way we're thinking about services and supports, and really is requiring services to think through how we're going to provide services in the most integrated setting possible. So a number of states throughout the country have been, well, there have been Department of Justice decisions in specific states that have examined or have used Title II to say, you need to do more to provide integrated services for people with disabilities. And this applies to schools, this applies to adult services. So we're really looking at ways to improve that access for people with disabilities, have people engaged in these different environments and different activities. In 1990, we saw the first provision of transition services outlined in an IDEA. So although IDEA, or the Public Law 94-142, was enacted in 1975, there was no specific provision for transition services. We weren't addressing transition at that point. It took, 20 years to get a provision of transition services embedded within this legislation, because we started to see that access doesn't always guarantee an outcome, or access doesn't always guarantee a result. So just because you're included in something, or just because a person with a disability is included in something, it doesn't always mean they're going to achieve an outcome or a result. So the transition mandate was really designed to help improve these outcomes in regard to employment, independent living, post-secondary education. Okay, and then we move forward to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And once again, this piece of legislation, in my mind, is really changing the way we're thinking about services and supports. And it places a great deal of emphasis on employment for people with the most significant disabilities. So under WIOA, it really expands employment and training services for workers, youth, and other individuals. And it also includes adult education, family literacy, and it also amended the state vocational rehabilitation, or the Rehabilitation Act, and required states to set aside 15% of their Title I funding, which is the program component of the Rehabilitation Act, for pre-employment transition services, which I'll talk about here shortly. So what we saw, and if you're looking at this timeline, it's really important to think this through, because early on we were focusing on access, and we started to say, gosh, wait a minute, we're not getting there. We're not achieving the outcomes that we want. So we have to do more from a legislative standpoint to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities. So I'm going to explore a couple of these with you, particularly the Rehabilitation Act and the Transition Amendment, so you can see what we're required to do in order to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities. Are there any questions before I move on?
No questions in the chat thus far.
Okay. So let's take a look at the Rehabilitation Act. I think the Rehabilitation Act is a really, really important piece of legislation. It's really, like I said, it's been a game changer in terms of promoting access for people with disabilities. And when you look at legislation, I always like to look at the precepts, because that really sets the foundation for that specific piece of legislation. And this reflects this idea, this universal idea, that we have to have higher expectations for people with disabilities, and that we have to ensure that people with disabilities receive services in the most integrated setting possible, and that they're meaningful, right? I think one of the things, and I'll explore this, that we often do with people with disabilities as providers or support professionals, is we develop supports and services that are based on what we think they want, not on what the individual with a disability wants. And so when it comes to employment, we may be placing a person in a job that they're not interested in, and they're not going to maintain that job. So the Rehabilitation Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act really work on this foundation that this programs and services and supports need to be meaningful and individually tailored to the unique needs of an individual. So I'm going to just look at this precept really quick. And it says, disability is a part of the human experience and no way diminishes the right of individuals to live independently, enjoy self-determination, make choices, contribute to society, pursue meaningful careers, and enjoy the full inclusion and integration in economic, political, social, cultural, and the educational mainstream of America. So this really promotes this access piece. So people with disabilities need to be included in all facets of our community. And then it also is starting to look at this result or this outcome, saying we need to do more to promote these specific outcomes. So let's look at some of these outcomes or these provisions that are really designed to promote employment that are embedded within the Rehabilitation Act. One of the most important provisions, or a really important provision in the Rehabilitation Act, is it explicitly defines what competitive integrated employment is. So prior to the Rehabilitation Act, people were calling employment when individuals were earning sub-minimum wage or working in shelter workshops or congregate facilities, we were calling that employment. And in my mind, that's not employment. If I'm working for a wage, it better be what everybody else is being paid, not a sub-minimum wage. I'm not clustered away with other individuals with disabilities. I'm included in all aspects of the employment process. So this provision of defining competitive integrated employment was really important. And this was outlined in the 2014 amendments. So when we're talking about competitive integrated employment, we specifically mean work that's performed on a full-time or part-time basis for an individual that earns at least commensurate wages, minimum wages, paid commensurate to what everybody else is making. So it's the equal wage, and is in a location where the individual interacts with other persons without disabilities. And this is really important because we still have a number of segregated programs out there. We still pay people with disabilities sub-minimum wage, and it's just this, we have this unequal treatment of people with disability in regard to employment. This was designed to level the playing field in some respect. The Rehabilitation Act also developed or further defined the provision of supported and customized employment. So supported employment was first outlined in the Rehabilitation Act in 1986. So we've had a provision of supported employment since 1986. And if you're not familiar with supported employment is a way to provide individualized supports to an individual with significant disabilities to help him or her achieve competitive integrated employment. What we saw over the years, and this goes back to access, result, and outcome on that timeline that I was talking about earlier, what we saw over the years is that supported employment was really only successful or being utilized for people who we perceived to be employable, right? So people that we thought, oh, these individuals would can gain meaningful employment. And oftentimes people with the most significant disabilities were not included in this process, and they were given services in more congregate facilities. So customized employment was outlined in the statute, and customized employment is really designed to support people with more significant disabilities and to help these individuals obtain competitive integrated employment. So supported employment works off the assumption that we're going after market-driven jobs, meaning I see a help wanted sign or a employer's advertising a position, and through support of a CRP or a community rehabilitation provider, we go in and help that individual obtain that job. Customized employment, on the other hand, the way to think about customized employment is if we go in and create that job. The job didn't exist before we started the conversation with the employer. So it's truly customized, and it's individual and specific to an individual with a disability. So customized employment, it's receiving a lot of attention lately. We're still working out some of the some fidelity measures and really trying to outline these exact provisions of what are exact elements of customized employment, but it's now a provision in statute. So state rehabilitation offices or agencies need to offer customized employment as a provision to promote employment outcomes for people with the most significant disabilities. And finally, another really important piece of this provision designed to promote competitive integrated employment was limitations in sub-minimum wages for people with disabilities. So under Section 511, this places specific limitations on paying an individual sub-minimum wage. So sub-minimum wage, if you're not familiar with it, it's regulated by the Department of Labor. and you have to go in and do a time study and so on and so forth to pay an individual with a disability these sub-minimum wages. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of oversight in terms of sub-minimum wage. So in my mind, I think sub-minimum wages get abused. And also, I think we should never pay an individual sub-minimum wage. But this was the Rehabilitation Act really addressed this idea of sub-minimum wage. And it was really designed to help people who were in the transition phases really ensure that these individuals weren't going to transition from school to employment that's paying sub-minimum wage. So under this provision, individuals who are under 24 cannot be paid sub-minimum wage unless he or she meets several specific requirements that are outlined in the Act. They have to receive pre-employment transition services, which I'm going to talk about here shortly. They have to apply for vocational rehabilitation and have been determined or found ineligible for specific services, and or determined eligible but hasn't been successful in finding work. So I think, as we're talking about these supports and provisions that are available to people with more significant disabilities, if we're using a customized employment approach, typically we can find people work. So I would think that we would never pay an individual with a disability a sub-minimum wage. There are other provisions that are specifically related to transition, and that's what we're here to talk about, is pre-employment transition services. So as I indicated earlier, under the Rehabilitation Act, when it was amended in WIOA 2014, the amendments added a provision for pre-employment transition services. So states were obligated to allocate 15% of their Title I funds. The Title I funds are programs and services that are administered by the Rehabilitation Act towards pre-employment transition services for a student with a disability. So a student with a disability is an individual with a disability in a secondary, post-secondary, or other recognized education program who is not younger than the earliest age for a provision of transition services under IDEA. So in the statute, in the federal statute, that's 16. And the federal statute also says states can go younger. So I'm here in Utah. Utah's provision for transition starts at 14, right? So pre-ETS, a 14-year-old can access pre-ETS. The individual is not older than 21, and the individual is eligible in receiving special education or related services. So under special education, we'll talk about this here momentarily. You have to be eligible for special education related services and have to be diagnosed or have to have meet one of 13 disability categories under IDEA. So that would mean specific learning disabilities, other health impairment, autism spectrum disorder, emotional disturbances, speech and language impairments, visual impairments, deafness, intellectual and developmental disability, multiple disabilities, traumatic brain injury, orthopedic impairment, deaf blindness, and hearing impairments. You might want to count those and make sure I got them all, because I may not have gotten them all. But that encompasses the 13 disability categories. If you don't meet one of those 13 disability categories, then you could qualify under Section 504 of the Act. So if a student has a Section 504 plan but doesn't meet the IDEA categories, that individual or that student can also receive pre-employment transition services. So pre-employment transition services are offered through the Rehabilitation Act, okay? So pre-employment transition services include job exploration counseling. So job exploration counseling means the student receives information on vocational interests. So might do an interest inventory, or the labor market, demand, industries and occupations, routes to employment, so on and so forth. So it's just basically what it implies. You're counseling, or the individual's receiving specific counseling on employment opportunities or employment options. We can also provide work-based learning experiences, which may include in-school or after-school opportunities. And so this would be things like job shadowing, career mentoring, anything related to career development, informational interviewing, so on and so forth. And I'll talk about these in more detail here momentarily when I talk about strategies we know work. counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary education programs. So this is really important because we can't just assume that a person's just automatically going to transition into competitive employment when they exit school. For some individuals, a pathway to employment might be through post-secondary education. So we have to provide counseling, or through PreEts, we have to provide counseling on post-secondary options. So we might look at community colleges, universities, other training programs that are available to people, look at trade or technical schools, anything that's post-secondary educated related. Another PreEts activity is workplace readiness training to develop social skills and independent living skills. So we might be providing, an individual some training or support on hygiene, time management, how to use a cell phone, money management, nutrition, a host of different things that one needs in order to maintain employment. Or we might look at financial literacy or mobility skills training, or something that an individual might need, okay? And then finally, we're looking at instruction in self-advocacy, which can include, peer mentoring. And this self-advocacy piece is really important in my mind, and we should really be developing all of our programs and all of our support strategies within this lens, that we need to, ensure that people with disabilities are self-determined and that they kind of direct services and supports, especially when we get to transition aged individuals. Any questions on the Rehabilitation Act and pre-employment transition services?
No questions yet. I think so. There are a couple of comments in the chat saying that, just engaging with your content from Cheryl here. She says, I just did a 511C project, and you would be surprised at how many places do not want their disabled employees to have this opportunity. They even convince parents why it is not good for their disabled loved ones.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I was a teacher, I remember when I worked in a post-high program, and I remember specifically working with students to get them work competitive integrated employment. And this is before we use that term, but just employment. And I remember the resistance that I had from parents too. And one of the things that they were always worried about, Cheryl, is they were like, I don't want my son or daughter to work because they're going to lose their benefits. So they were specifically worried about their SSI benefits. And they're like, if my son or daughter loses or goes to work, then these benefits are reduced. And so what I would always recommend in that case is that they would go and talk to a benefits planner and really understand how work impacts specific benefits. But, one of the things that's really interesting is parents of individuals with disabilities don't get a manual on how to do this stuff. And we need to educate parents as well about what this all looks like and show successful experiences so there's not that fear. So yeah, good point. Any other thoughts or questions?
Not in the chat thus far.
All right. So now let's look at the individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So once again, I like to just look at these precepts because it really sets the foundation of the intent of the legislation, what this legislation was really designed to do. And keep in mind, prior to 1975, we had very low expectations for people with disabilities in regard to education, right? So schools were making unilateral decisions just to kick people out of school because individuals with disabilities were deemed uneducable, meaning they were like, we can't provide an education to these individuals, or individuals with disabilities who had some behavioral type issues in schools. Schools would just say, we're not equipped to dealing with this, so we're not going to provide education to an individual with disabilities. So the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was really instrumental in ensuring that access for people with disabilities. And as it's evolved over the years, it really has expanded to look at these outcomes and these results. So let's just quickly look at the precepts so you kind of get a sense of, the intent of this specific legislation. And, this reinforces right here, Congress reinforced that after 30 years of research and experience has demonstrated that education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by simply having high expectations. So this idea of high expectations and specific to employment is critical. You look at an individual without a disability who's going through the educational process. Education is designed to promote employment outcomes, whether we do it through a pathway of post-secondary education or a trade school, or you just move right into employment. The intent of education is to help people get jobs and be educated and learn how to navigate the adult world. Unfortunately, we had a dual system for people with disabilities, specifically people who meet one of these 13 disability categories, that those expectations aren't the same. And I think this is a really important thing to think about as we're designing supports and services for people with disabilities. And when I train a lot of people who are doing employment supports for people with disabilities, and I always tell people that what we're doing is a value-based system or a value-based approach. That if you don't have a high expectation and you do not value competitive and integrated employment for all people, it becomes really hard to do your job. Because I can guarantee you that there will be individuals that will challenge your assumptions down the road. And you have to really value employment for all and have this high expectation. So have high expectations for children, ensuring access to the general education curriculum, regular classroom to the maximum extent possible to meet developmental goals and the challenges, expectations that have been established for all children, and also high expectations to lead productive and independent adult lives, right? That's what we're trying to do in regard to transition. So when we think about transition, or we think about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's a civil rights piece of legislation, and it's also a funding piece of legislation, right? So the civil rights piece of IDEA provides basic guarantees to individuals who have one of those 13 disability categories. First and foremost, that we provide a free, appropriate public education, commonly known as FAPE. So you'll hear this, people refer to FAPE all the time. A free, appropriate public education that's in the least restrictive environment. So we want to promote individuals with disabilities accessing the general ed curriculum and accessing the general environment that students without disabilities engage, that it's individualized, that it's tailored to the individual needs of a student with a disability, and that we thoroughly evaluate an individual with a disability. So we can tailor these programs for these individuals, that we're not just doing a blanket program for everyone. They're individualized to the student with a disability. So it's really a zero reject law, that all children with disabilities who were once considered uneducable are now considered educable. And we're not just talking academic skills, we're talking functional skills as well. So, we have to build on these academic skills, but for a person with a more significant disability, we might start working on functional skills, those skills that are critical to promoting better outcomes, adult outcomes, that we embed procedural safeguards. So we have to have these safeguards in place so we don't unilaterally exclude people with disabilities in programs and services. And then we provide notice and hearing rights, right? So parents have to receive notices, students with disabilities have to receive notices. And once they reach that age of majority, the student with a disability should start driving the show and really engaging in this whole process. So in a nutshell, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is really designed to promote access. Now, as you recall from my timeline, I was painting the picture that we had this access, but we weren't really doing anything in regard to transition. And we didn't have a transition provision until 1990. So what we were starting to find out is, well, you got to plan for employment. It doesn't just happen automatically. So we were seeing that individuals, prior to the 1990 transition mandate, that individuals with disabilities were transitioning to really dismal outcomes, right? Across the board. that people with disabilities weren't weren't obtaining meaningful employment, weren't engaging in independent living, so on and so forth. So these outcomes were quite dismal. So there was a number of seminal studies that went on in the early 80s that really kind of looked at what is a predictor of employment success for students with disabilities. And one of these predictors was that you have to have a job before you leave school. If an individual or a student with a disability has it, and this was in 1980s, 1984, the specific study that I'm referencing, Hazazi's study, they basically made this correlation that individuals who had work before they left school were the individuals that had maintained work when they left school. Critical, right? So this started the discussion about employment and how we transition from school to work. So Madeline Will, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, or Secretary of Education, not State, Secretary of Education in the 1980s, developed this bridges model. And she was like, all right, if we're going to do, and this was before we had anything embedded in legislation or the transition mandate. She said, if we're going to do transition, or we're going to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities, then we have these bridges that one can take. So one bridge to employment is no special services, meaning an individual with a disability is just going to, utilize the resources that are available to everybody to obtain employment. So there's going to be a pocket of individuals that will just cross that bridge and they should be okay, but we have to help them find those resources. And then there are going to be a certain set of individuals that need time limited supports. So that time limited support would be like supported employment, right? So supported employment is time limited through vocational rehabilitation, right? And then it extends to ongoing services down the road. But there might be some people that just need a little bit of support to move over to employment. Some individuals are going to cross that bridge. And then we have ongoing support. So there are going to be some individuals who have significant support needs who are going to need ongoing supports and services in order to engage in employment. So this was a very simplistic idea, but it was started people talking about this and they're like, how are we going to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities? We need to figure this out. It doesn't just happen automatically, right? So this bridges model was really the cornerstone of what we're doing right now. And it really started the conversations about employment and how we engage in employment. Other people, Halpern came along shortly thereafter, this was in 1985, and said, well, there are other things that we have to consider. Employment isn't everything. Employment is important, but we have to look at the larger aspects of community adjustment, right? How do we get people involved in all aspects of their community? So he developed this kind of a community adjustment model. And he said, you have high school, you have the services that are going to help you engage in community adjustment. So generic, time limited, and ongoing. But he said, now we have to start looking at residential or independent living. We also have to look at employment. Employment's one of those strong pillars. And then social and interpersonal networks or connections. So he was like, transition isn't just about employment. Transition is about the big picture that we all engage in when we think about employment, right? Where we all want to have these components, or we all have these components in our lives right now. And he was like, we have to ensure that people with disabilities have the same option, or students with disabilities are transitioning to the same, are adjusting to the demands of the community, right? Any questions or thoughts on these models as I'm moving forward?
And there was one question that came in from Brian, who says, have a question about my rights. I'm a certified peer specialist. I got to take a test to get my CUs. There are times and I got to take tests and I have an ID diagnosis. What are the rights involved with kind of this process?
Of the taking a test?
Yeah, for the certified peer specialist. And maybe I'll come back. I'll chat with Brian in the chat a little bit. And there's also a comment from Melissa who could be useful here and also could be held at the end, is as a parent of a 20-year-old with PDD, NOS, ADHD, how can I go about getting her help for employment, especially as she's over the age of 18, in the context of maybe some of these models?
Well, I think first and foremost, it as through pre-employment transition services. So, I think you could tap into state VR in regard to the pre-employment transition services. That would be my first approach. And then pre-employment transition services is one arm of vocational rehabilitation. They also just have transition caseloads, right? So this is designed for just students who are engaged in transition. And then you can apply for VR services and be on a transition caseload and then start receiving some of those specific services that we know are critical to employment success. So they would develop an employment plan, and depending on the state you're in, I don't know what state, vend for services with what we call community rehabilitation providers, and community rehabilitation providers would then help develop a job or develop supports necessary to get a specific job. So I would tap into the state VR system. That answer your question?
Awesome. And Faith has an assist for you where she sent you a link to the VR office in there. So no other questions currently.
Oh, perfect. All right. So here's what we know. We had these supports and services, or we had the provision for access in regard to IDEA. Students with disabilities could have access, but there wasn't a standardized or a provision related to transition. In 1990, Congress amended the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It's hard to keep all these things straight. And they changed the name to the Individuals with Disabilities Act, but they also added a provision for transition. So now schools were obligated to start addressing transition for students with disabilities. So as part of the individual educational plan, they had to have a transition component to this whole piece. So we started to address transition for students with disabilities. So it's had several iterations, several revisions since 1990, but now we're looking at this results factor. It used to be an outcome-oriented process. Now it's a result-oriented process. So Congress was saying, we have to start doing more to produce results. And so transition planning should really be designed to facilitate movement from school to post-secondary activities. And this is important, including post-secondary education. So schools are obligated to start looking at this post-secondary education planning piece, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported and customized employment, continuing and adult education, adult services, independent living, and community participation. So we knew, or what we were finding is that just having access, a student being included in education, didn't guarantee an outcome. So Congress in 1990 said we need to do more. So they added this substantive provision and said, we need to do more to promote these better outcomes for individuals with disabilities. So now schools are obligated to develop a transition plan and really start addressing each one of these components. Ideally, these transition plans should be student-driven. Unfortunately, what we know from data right now is they're not always student-driven. Oftentimes, it's like the transition teacher and the professionals develop the transition plan with little input from the student, and I think that's slowly changing. But all of this should be student-driven and based on strengths, interests, and needs of the individual. The transition mandate is a really important piece, and I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of what's required in a transition plan, but know that it is there and that schools are obligated to start addressing transition. Another thing that I forgot to mention is this National Guidepost for Success. And this just really paints the picture that I've already been talking about in regard to transition and thinking about transitioning from school to adult outcomes. The National Guidepost for Success articulates what I've already been articulating. having high expectations for youth with disabilities, individualized inclusion and integration for everybody, full participation supported by self-determination, informed choice and decision-making, independent living, including the development of long-term supports and services. We have to have those embedded in order to make this stuff work, competitive employment, and individualized, person-centered, and culturally and linguistically appropriate transition service or transition planning. So this encapsulates everything that I've just been talking about, that we should be thinking this through as we're developing these transition plans and supports. So I know that was an hour policy talk, and I'm just looking at the time, so I'm sorry I like to think about policy and think about where we are, but we've been doing this for a long time. And so I always scratch my head when I look at this chart here. I'm always like, gosh, where are we? Why are we having these issues? So this is a data from, well, several places, one from the American Community Survey, and the other is from the National Report on Employment Services and Outcomes, the state data report from ICI out of Boston, UMass. And so let me just walk you through this, and maybe we can pause for a second, reflect on why we're not getting better outcomes. So the dark orange bar in this chart is data from the ACS. So I pulled data from, I think it was 16 to 65, employment outcomes for individuals 16 to 65. And so the ACS looks at all disability categories, right? So when the ACS is a supplement to the census, and it's distributed annually to about 3 million households, and it collects outcome data or employment data. So you look at these data, and about 33.9% of people with disabilities, I'm talking all people with disabilities, in 2010 were employed. Fast forward to 2018, which is the last data available, 37.8% of people with disabilities are employed. There hasn't been a big shift. It's kind of flatlined, okay? I'm sure there's been a downturn over the past couple of years, especially when we think about COVID. The other one, the lighter orange, is competitive integrated employment. So this is for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are receiving HCBS services, essentially. So that home and community-based waiver services. So you look at these data, and about 19.9% of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in 2010 were employed in competitive integrated environments. Fast forward to 2017, I don't know why my 2018 data didn't show up, but 2017, only 20.3% are employed in competitive integrated employment. I know the data for 2018 is not much higher than that, maybe 1/10 of a percent or 2/10 of a percent. So you look at these data and you're like, nothing's changed there either. And then you look at the lighter orange bar. So this one is the one that sometimes I just scratch my head and I'm like, what are we doing? We've been doing this stuff for 50 years and we're still running into this problem. So you look at these data, and we've got about, in 2010, we have 80% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are receiving services in facility-based settings. My fatigue is catching up to me. Facility-based settings. So these are settings that include sheltered workshops, non-work settings, or day programs, right? So these are segregated clustered settings where it's all people with disabilities. 80% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities receiving HCBS services are in a facility-based setting in 2010. Fast forward to the present, we're right around 80%. So there hasn't been a big shift in terms of what we're doing in regard to employment for people with disabilities. So every time I look at these data, I'm like, what is going on here? Here we have legislation in place. I showed you the legislation timeline. It's all there. The legislation has been designed to promote better outcomes and results, but we're still confronted with this issue. And I've thought about this a lot, and I think it all boils down to expectations. We still have an us-them paradigm, and we don't believe, or a lot of individuals don't believe in this idea that employment is something everybody can achieve. And so it's this expectation problem that I'm seeing. And when you have low expectations, you don't deliver services and supports that are designed to promote these better outcomes. Do you all have any thoughts or ideas about these data?
Prior to moving on to the thoughts, Tim, can you speak a little bit to where the data actually come from and how they gather it to help us contextualize some of this info?
Yeah, well, the ACS data, that's an annual supplement. So they send out a survey to random survey to 3 million households, and they ask a series of questions related to disability. Number one, do you have a disability? And they have different categories. So they're looking at just the larger context of disability. So all disabilities, and I can't, right off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact questions. And then they ask, are you employed? It's that simple. And so that's that ACS data. The other data from the ICI looks at outcome data from states. So states have to promote or provide outcome data on where they're serving specific individuals. So that comes from state DD agencies or developmental disability agencies. So here in Utah, that would be DSPD, Division of Services for People with Disabilities. So this is DD specific or ID specific. Does that help, Ty?
Yeah, no, I think that does help. There are a couple more questions too now. So the question here is, I'd like to see the overlay of waiver funding. As funding is cut, are people having to select the cheaper segregated funds? I don't know if you know the answer, if there's a direct answer, but what are your thoughts there?
Oh, there's a direct answer. So there's actually, when you look at the funding mechanisms here, so if I put up this graph right now and took away the ACS stuff, right? So just visualize this. If I put up this exact same graph and took away the dark orange, and then I changed this graph to funding, they would look the same, meaning the 80.9% would be dollars that are spent on segregated settings, and the 19.1, I'm looking at 2013, the 19.1 would be dollars that are spent on competitive integrated employment. So what I'm saying is that it's disproportionate. The money that we spend on segregated settings far outweighs the money that we spend on integrated setting. It's a funding thing too. We encourage segregation through funding mechanisms.
So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Well, Faith hasn't responded. That was Faith's question. She hasn't followed back up yet. So I'm gonna guess that at least gives us a good start.
So it's not all doom and gloom though. I put this up here as a reflection because there are some pockets of people doing this amazing work in regard to promoting better outcomes for people with disabilities, and we're changing. We are changing over time, and things are going to shift. I'm sure of it. We're making progress, but I like to put this up as just a reflection of we've been doing this for a long time, and we're still running into these poor outcomes for people with disabilities across the board. It doesn't matter what the disability type, we're still running into poor outcomes. And in my mind, it's expectation. And then with expectation becomes this idea of capacity building. People who support people with disabilities need to understand how to promote these better outcomes and how to utilize strategies that we know work to promote better outcomes. So let's take a look at what we know is happening and what we know are some of the, well, first of all, some of the barriers that we're seeing, and then also what we know works in terms of promoting better outcomes for people with disabilities. So this is a study I did in 2014, looking at what are some of the school to work barriers as identified by special educators. So special education teachers, transition teachers are charged with providing transitions of services as outlined by IDEA, vocational rehabilitation counselors, So vocational rehabilitation counselors have a transition caseload, and this was before PreET, so we didn't have any provision of PreETs, but they had a transition caseload, so they were providing transition services and supports. And then community rehabilitation providers or professionals. So these were the individuals that provide employment supports to individuals with disabilities. They help these individuals from an adult service perspective go out and get jobs. So I did a study looking at what are some of these barriers, right? What's some of the issues that we're dealing with in regard to promoting better outcomes in terms of employment for people with disabilities. We did a Delphi, which is a consensus building process where we were kind of trying to figure out what these professionals believe and think. And this is what we found out. We found out that networking is one of the biggest barriers in regard to promoting better employment outcomes. So from a school to work perspective, we're not building solid relationships with employers. So in order to make employment work, you have to engage with employers. And what we are finding is that schools or professionals who are charged with providing employment supports aren't developing these relationships with employers. So that makes it really hard to get people with disabilities jobs. Another barrier is student involvement skills. And this one shocked me when we started to look at some of these data. The highest ranked barrier out of all the barriers that we identified was that the student lacked employment skills. And for me, I kind of scratched my head and I was like, well, what does this mean? That's, we know that oftentimes people with intellectual developmental disabilities or other students with disabilities aren't given the same chances and opportunities to pursue employment as individuals without disabilities. So we know they're going to lack employment skills. It's the job of these professionals to teach those specific skills to an individual with a disability. So this one just really interested me. And I was like, well, that was just really interesting to me. And it showed that we need to do more to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities in regard to employment. And having those high expectations is one way to think about it. So to put this in perspective, I always think about, like, when I think about my career pathway and my trajectory to work, the expectation from my family was that I work. It's always been the expectation, and it always is from the time I was 13 that I would go out and get a job. So whether that meant I would go to my neighbor's house and pick up poop and try to get $5 or whatever to go buy some penny candy at the 7-Eleven, or I actually got a job when I was age 14 to have money to spend. That was always my expectation. And I don't think we have that same expectation for all people with disabilities, that you go out and work and that you build that career identity. And this is perhaps why we see this student lacks employment skills, because individuals with disabilities are not engaged in that same level of work or developing that work identity. That students lack self-determination skills. So self-determination is a learned skill. You're not born to be self-determined. You have to learn how to be self-determined. And we need professionals who can train individuals and support people with disabilities to make self-determined and informed choices. Lack of knowledge about community resources. And this is from a student perspective, from an educator perspective, from a parent perspective, from a VR perspective, that people don't always understand what's available in regard to supporting people with disabilities and obtaining employment. Parent-family involvement is another barrier. Specific to expectations were either too high or too low for an individual. So there was a range of expectations. Lack of knowledge about adult services. And I've been doing some focus groups the past couple of weeks with parents for another project that I'm working on right now. And this theme emerged again. They're like, there's so many things that we don't know about in regard to adult services that it makes it really challenging for us to navigate these systems to promote these better outcomes. And then lack of knowledge about specific statutes, legislative statutes related to promoting transition outcomes. And then finally, community integration and access, that typically people or students with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities, don't have access to the community. and that there are low expectations from the community. So when we're thinking about employment, oftentimes employers don't think about how we're going to engage with a person with a disability or hire a person with a disability. And I could have a whole session on what employers think about hiring people with disabilities. This piggybacks and goes back, if you go up to the top of my PowerPoint, goes back to how important networking is. That you have to establish relationships with employers so they understand how we do employment or how we facilitate employment, especially for a person with a more significant disability or a person who needs more significant supports on the job. You have to network. It's the only way we can do it.
Tim, I'm curious before you move on kind of those barriers, one that's circulating and I think is especially germane to, Utah here is transportation issues, especially in those rural areas. I'm curious if you could speak to that at all in your experience.
Yeah, well, I know for a fact transportation is always a barrier for employment. It's one of the biggest barriers that we see. So if we do all our work that I was just talking about and a person has inadequate transportation to and from work, that becomes an issue. And Ty, this is really interesting because I've been working on another study that I've been doing, and we are talking specific about transition. This is the interesting part. States have like when we're thinking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, a lot of states in their, when they're talking about HCBS services and DD services, they have provisions or codes for transportation to and from day programs. They do not reciprocate to employment programs. So meaning, going back to this funding disparity, states will fund transportation to a day program, but they're not funding transportation to a employment program. It boggles our mind.
Which
So
I'm curious, is that kind of your strong emphasis on policy and understanding how that goes because they're so intricate and feed into each other? If we don't understand and influence the policy, we're not going to understand and influence the outcomes. Is that kind of how you conceptualize it all?
that's how I totally conceptualize it. If you don't understand how it all works, then you can't make these changes and work to make these changes happen for sure. And I know I'm running out of time, so I get long-winded, so I apologize. So I'm going to start going through some of the stuff that I think is really important that you all understand. Improving employment outcomes, outcomes. A little typo there. I apologize, but one of the strongest predictors of post-school employment is whether or not an individual with a disability held a paid job during high school. So people who work while they're in high school are the ones that maintain jobs after school. So this critically reinforces the idea that when we're talking about transition, that paid employment is something we need to achieve and obtain prior to leaving school, because this is one of the biggest predictors of post-school success. And just having that job, that first job, that, doesn't mean that that's going to be your career for the rest of your life. It just means you got a job. So my first job was washing dishes. I don't wash dishes now as a living, but I needed that job. And that job taught me a lot of really important skills, social skills, financial skills, a whole host of skills that one needs to learn in order to maintain employment. Work-based learning is the one avenue or one pathway to employment, right? So work-based learning from a school standpoint can include job training, job shadowing. So students go out and shadow employers and look what's happening and talk to employers. So I did some work years ago with some school districts here in the Salt Lake Valley where I am, and had students go out and job shadow a number of employers. And it was amazing the type of employers that let you go in and do these job shadows. We went into tattoo parlors. We went into crime units for a local sheriff department. We went into a place that manufactures missile casings for MX missiles. And it was all based on student interest. But it's just a matter of contacting the employer and say, can we come in and look and have the student interview and see what's going on? Engaged in service learning. Oftentimes individuals with disabilities are left out of this service learning component. Service learning, you have to have a course at the school that the student is enrolled in, and then you go out and do a service learning project. Internships are critical and are gaining a lot of prominence right now in terms of students with disabilities. And I always reinforce the importance of paid internships, that we should always look for those paid internship opportunities. And if you're doing internship opportunities, you need to make sure that you follow the guidance outlined in the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? There's strict guidance of what's going on with doing an internship program. Volunteering leads to better outcomes for people with disabilities. And this is something that I always want to make abundantly clear. Volunteering doesn't mean free work at a business. That's not volunteering. So I hear this all the time when I'm working with school, and they're like, our students volunteer at Walmart. I'm like, what? You don't volunteer at Walmart. You intern at Walmart, or you do paid job training at Walmart, or you do job training at Walmart. You do not volunteer at Walmart. You volunteer at your civics, your local church, or your humane society, or a nonprofit organization. You do not volunteer at a for-profit business. I want to make that abundantly clear because it's abused all the time with people with disabilities. And then, of course, paid employment. So these work-based learning opportunities that are critical, and work to establish those in all transition activities. It's critical. I did a study in 2019 looking at what employers think about work-based learning activities. And I'm just going to really quickly go over two of the key points here. First and foremost, if we're establishing work-based learning, we need to ensure that the professionals who are developing these work-based learning opportunities understand what they're doing, right? So employers said that if you're creating a workplace learning program for students, and this was in the context of intellectual and developmental disabilities, make sure that it's part of an established program, meaning you have procedures and guidelines to create these work-based learning opportunities. And then also provide job coaches or support staff who understand business. Because what employers were seeing is that people would come in and provide those supports in regard to a work-based learning activity. And while they're engaging, they're either playing on their cell phone, or they're not necessarily providing any systematic instruction or engaging with helping the individual learn the task. They just basically say, here's a person and have at it. And they're like, if we want to have these better relationships with employers, you got to make sure that this is an established program, that we have clear outlined expectations from both the student, the teacher, and the employer, and that we have professionals who understand how to do this stuff. That makes higher expectations higher in my mind. So when we're thinking about employment, one of the things that we should do from a transition standpoint, conduct formal and informal transition assessments that are always student-driven, driven by the student needs, to identify strengths, interests, and needs as they relate to employment, and other things such as independent living, post-secondary education, but we're here talking about employment. Develop employment-related transition goals and a framework for measuring progress on goals and objectives, and also develop a pathway to employment. Is that pathway through post-secondary education? Is that pathway through a trade school? Is that pathway just through getting a job? Develop that pathway. Do engage in meaningful career exploration, focus on community connections, CTE, career and technical education, internships, paid employment. And this is something that I want to stress. When we're developing these career exploration programs, these work-based learning opportunities, they have to be connected to what the student wants. I see this all the time when I'm working with schools, is they oftentimes develop 3 or 4 places where businesses that they work with in their community, and they rotate every student through that same job. And most of the time, or that job training opportunity, and most of the time the tasks that they do within those businesses are arbitrary and things that individuals don't do in real life. It's not teaching a student anything that's meaningful. So part of the issue that I'm seeing is that we're not connecting the dots. We're not doing our formal assessments well enough to really figure out the strengths, interests, and needs of an individual. And then we're not doing our homework and developing these networks to engage with employers so we can have an individual engage in these meaningful career exploration opportunities that are based on what they want to do, based on things that are interesting to them. And then finally connect with related service providers. A lot of great models out there that look at how we can connect with related service providers from a transition perspective. So one of which is called the service integration model. It's blending funds so we can maximize our resources to help a person obtain employment. And I'm going through this quickly. I apologize because I know I'm running out of time. So what we know in terms of general recommendations to promote better employment outcomes: start early. There's a ton of research out there on career development theories for all people, that career development is a lifelong process. It's not something that you just start when you turn 18. Career development occurs throughout the lifespan, and it starts early. You start to develop your career identity early, and that career identity is influenced by the way you're included and engaged in integrated opportunities, right? And so start the stuff early and get people thinking about stuff. I know, like in junior high, they start talking about career exploration, and they do a number of things that an individual, a student would do from a junior high context that's career specific. Oftentimes people with disabilities are left out of those programs or those activities. Have people engage in these activities. It's critical. And start developing that career work identity. If we start that early and we have that expectation that employment is something we can all achieve, I can guarantee you we'll have better outcomes. Have those high expectations. Link work experiences to interest and needs. I've already articulated how important that is. They have to be linked to what an individual wants to do, not arbitrary placements. Build local level employment coalitions, meaning this employment occurs at the local level, and there are different support avenues that we have to tap into to make it work. And this is especially true for people with the most significant disabilities. You have to engage these coalitions to make it work, right? So it's going back to that Will's pathway. Look at how we're going to develop that bridge and what bridge we're going to take, and think about who needs to be involved in helping that person cross that bridge. And then encourage active student involvement. We know when students are more involved in transition planning, they have better outcomes. So really encourage student-led IEPs and student-led transition planning, so they take charge and they take ownership of their plan to employment. Okay, so I went through that really quickly. So those are some of the ideas, some of the things that we know work, some of the things that we should do to promote better employment. I've included some resources here. One is from the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. They have a ton of resources related to transition. Take a look at it. They have all the evidence-based predictors. The other one is the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center. This has a lot of information on pre-employment transition services and customized employment. One is the Center for Employment and Inclusion. This is my project here at Utah State University. We have a ton of webinars related to employment of people with disabilities. The other one is the IPS Employment Center. So this IPS is the Individual Placement and Support Model for people with mental health disabilities. Take a look at this. They're doing some great work out of Dartmouth. And then the Zaro Center is another resource on terms of doing transition type assessments and developing transition related goals. So the links are all there. I can forward tie the PowerPoint so you guys can have the links and check out these specific resources. My contact is here. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions, or you want to talk about some of these issues, or have any additional questions related to this presentation. So I've left us about 10 minutes to spare. So if you have any specific questions, I can address them now.
Yeah, one just quick functional question, Tim. Can you go, is there any way you could go to the last slide and copy and paste those links, maybe just that whole block, into the chat function for people?
Of course, I'm gonna have to minimize here, but yeah.
That's just fine. Yeah, and as we're doing this, are there any questions for Dr. Riesen that y'all want to ask here in the chat that he can address in our last 4 minutes? Yeah, as far as the slides go, there's been a few questions about those. We're planning on trying to post all of this information, the video and the slides, to the MHDD Center in the next 2 weeks. So be looking there in the next few weeks as we try to organize and get everything posted.
I think I've got everything put on there, Ty, in terms of the chat. And yeah, I'll send you my PowerPoints too, so you can have a copy of these for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for throwing those in there.
Yep, of course. Well, thanks for your time today. I know some of that stuff I went through pretty quickly towards the end, but I think, you know, when we're thinking about transition, it's expectations. It's having that high expectation for transition to employment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim, for your time. It looks like we don't have any questions rolling in, so I'm going to make an executive decision and end a little bit early so I can get the next session set up on time.
Perfect.
So thank you so much for your time, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining. And I hope you can join us for our next session, presentation by Dr. Matthew Wappett on trying to strategically move the field forward. So thanks again for your time, and hope to see you in the next session.
Thanks, Ty.
Adios.